all watch me blush. That's gonna happen, especially in future sessions if my parents do join.
Oh my goodness.
All right. So we're talking about, oh, here is Juliet. We're talking about sex in the text, which is like, it's a fun rhyme and definitely a way that it was presented to us in like Nifty at Kutz Camp at I took a college weekend thing at Hebrew Union College when I was in undergrad. So this is like a reform movement regular go-to topic. And I am using a lot of, I couldn't find the curriculum. I tried, it's called Sacred Choices, the curriculum they used for young adults of my generation. I don't know if they still use it for current young adults. It was definitely like a big push under the Eric Yaffe presidentship of
Mhm.
the RJ. But I found a lot of references to it online, but I couldn't find anywhere to even like buy or download the curriculum still, which is fine because it's aimed at a much younger group than this. But I was very curious. I was like, I know I got this
Yeah, right.
information and I can't remember exactly what I was taught. So, but so the book aimed at adults that the CCAR press puts out is called The Sacred Encounter: Jewish Perspectives on Sexuality. So that is primarily my source now. Uh, not a, other potential good sources. So Sacred Encounter is very like Reform Jewish sexual ethics. It's completely the topic that we want, but it's also a pretty thick book. And it's not super like esoteric, but it is like dense nonfiction reading. Other suggestions for reading, if this is a topic of interest to you, is Ruth Calderon's A Bride for One Night, which is a series of like reimagined or like extended stories from the Talmud. They all come from things that are said in the Talmud itself, of the rabbis engaging in things that we might now think are like ethically questionable, like sexual choices. And so that's Bride for One Night by Ruth Calderon. And the other one is 50 Shades of Talmud by Maggie Anton, which is also like a similar pithy. Hers is presented not as like A Bride for One Night are these little vignettes. They're nonfiction. I mean, sorry, they are fiction stories that are based on these true comments from the Talmud. 50 Shades of Talmud is more just like, here's a funny thing that's in the Talmud, and then her little like cute analysis of like what that says about ancient rabbis' views of sex. But it is even though it's more nonfiction, it's a much lighter read than Sacred Encounter. So those are other, like, just throwing those out there. But for like, all right, now we're gonna get into the real stuff here, the halacha. So the basis of Jewish traditional views of sexual ethics is it very much stems from the end of Genesis. God says to the first people, be fruitful and multiply. So from here, this is seen as the first commandment. The very first divine commandment is procreation. And from that, like this heavy focus on marriage, family, intimacy, companionship, all these other things that are very important, and that Judaism, like later Jewish texts, definitely play up, that it can't just be about procreation, but that's where it starts. And so these other things that do evolve, they give us as more modern thinkers who, there's lots of couples out there with love between them that should be able to have, share their affection and intimacy, but for whatever reason, are not or cannot have children, or at least like there's not a direct correlation between the physical intimacy and the arrival of children in their home. And because of all the other writings about what's important in a marriage and what's grounds for divorce and all these things, there's so much room in Jewish texts to be really what we would call today like sex positive, expansive in our acceptance of different family types, all of this. But it would be disingenuous to say that that is the primary Jewish value. Like really, the core of it, my camera just froze. Okay, the core of it, for whatever reason, not for whatever reason, the core of it for the reason of, what God says, and also if we're looking at it historically, we know that there was like a heavy emphasis on having children in the days when you had to like till your own ground, like it was, and when infant death was really high, like continuing procreation had a much different social value for everybody, for the whole world, in the ancient world. And then all the more so because this first commandment from God is be fruitful and multiply. So procreation, very important in Judaism. However, as I said, then there is lots of source material to show the value of intimacy and companionship in Judaism, primarily in the Talmud. There's not a lot. I mean, we have these stories of the matriarchs and the patriarchs in the Torah. Like there's lots of midrash around Rebecca and Isaac being like a true love match and things like this, but it's not super clear in the Bible itself that like actually liking each other is at all important in a marriage. But in the Talmud, they stress that a lot. So the Talmud has several tractates or volumes that relate to the question of marriage. So just a couple weeks ago, I think, I have totally fallen off the Daf Yomi cycle, but recently they were studying ketubot, which is about ketubah, marriage contracts. So it's very much about the halachic side of things, but it also addresses like what's to be expected. So a ketubah traditionally is like the prenuptial, it has like what kind of compensation the woman is entitled to in the event of a divorce, and like what counts as a annulment versus a divorce, or like when it's her fault versus his fault, or like a no fault or whatever. There's like, I mean, that's obviously very modern legal language, but those kinds of concepts are absolutely addressed in both ketubot and tractate Gittin, in like the plural for get, like for a Jewish right of divorce. Those topics come up, but then so it's a very like legalese approach, but among the things that are listed as like reasons for, or like things that you can put in your ketubah of like what you expect, it's like it includes like how often each couple expects to make love, to maintain that level of intimacy that's important in a relationship, and how often the woman is allowed to demand it depends on what her husband's job is. Lamar trying to get in. I'm not seeing his name come up in the thing.
I sent him the link again. Maybe he was using the wrong link.
Maybe. Sorry, I lost my train of thought with that. Oh, yes, sex. For enjoyment is also, I mean, I guess you could say like the way it's phrased too, like how often the woman demands it, probably like that language does kind of I think socially suggest that it is still more about procreation, right? Like she knows when she's ovulating, like when it's time to have sex for procreation, things like that, especially since so much of the misogynistic laws in Judaism have to do with like the premise that men are so easily tempted by women that they should always like that they'll always be ready to go. So it is a little strange that most of the Talmud laws about like that kind of expectation in marriage is very much put on the woman and not on the man. But anyway, but it doesn't say in it like anywhere like there's nothing in Ketubah. Sorry, that's not true, because the commandment to be fruitful and multiply applies for men, not women, which is another thing I was going to wait to, but then I realized I got kind of ahead of myself with the Ketubah thing. So the rabbis, this is like partially part of like the broader structure of halakha and what applies to men and what applies to women, and like time-based mitzvot can't apply to women because they're too busy with their own time-based restrictions based, because when they're menstruating, there's so many things they can't do anyway. So like they can't be expected to pray 3 times a day. I mean, like that is a huge jump, but like that's the kind of stuff that the Talmud says. So there's some element of the commandment to procreate is vaguely time-based, like having, but since it follows the clock that it prohibits women from doing other halachic things, or like in theory, that doesn't hold a lot of water. So what the rabbis also say is because of the danger of childbirth, that it would be unethical or like unrealistic almost. That's not quite the word I want, but like it would be too much to say that a woman must put herself through that. But a man must have an heir. So that is a thing that can be in the ketubah or in the divorce, right? That if a certain amount of time passes and they are not conceiving, they are expected to get divorced so that the man can find a fertile woman. And there are issues with this of like, how do we know she's the one that's not fertile? There's a lot of like assumptions about that in ancient times, and even now with couples, at least in the modern Orthodox world. I don't know for certain what the approaches to this are in like the ultra Orthodox or Hasidic communities. But at least for modern Orthodox Jews, they're modern enough that they are open to using medical intervention for their procreation. And, will go to a fertility clinic before they jump to having to get divorced for their infertility issues, and like do all of the things available to them to still have a child. But there's all these like restrictions and hesitancies around the male care. So if a woman goes in and finds out like whatever, there's something wrong with her cycle, she can take some hormones and like then get pregnant next month, boom, whatever. Or there's something wrong, I don't know, there's some barrier in her cervix, and so like an IVF will take care of it, or whatever it is, then they can go through that route easily. If that route is not showing any clear answers, and they have to test the man or things like that, there's more difficulty because of what's called the sin of Onan or onanism, which is like the wasting of seed, because the man is commanded to procreate in a way that a woman is not commanded to. You know, if she does IVF and fertilizes multiple eggs and then chooses the most viable ones to implant, that's not a waste of the other eggs. But if a man ejaculates into a cup for this study, you know, for the fertility tests, like that's a waste of that seed. And there's like, so there's all kinds of workarounds for those rules that I learned about just recently on a podcast called Intimate Judaism, which is it's hosted by a modern Orthodox rabbi and a psychologist, a female Orthodox psychologist. So it's very interesting, very informative. And since they were talking so much about these like workarounds, it did kind of lead me to believe that in the more ultra Orthodox community, they just go straight to divorce, like in the Talmud times, that they're just like, must be the woman, goodbye. But so those are some barriers to what we would see now as like the more important ethics and values around marriage, that is very much baked into our text and our Jewish law. But getting back to what I was saying, I like distracted myself a little bit about that question of like fertility issues and procreation and divorce. But getting back to the stuff in the Ketubah, and in Tractate Ketubah, when it talks about this, there is a lot about like expectations of intimacy, of like friendship. I don't know if the concept of romantic love per se factored in for them, but certainly like it was clearly important that they like each other. Like that couples could not just be about the other things that you think about in ancient times being the factors of matchmaking, right? Like it couldn't just be about these two families live next to each other and it would be beneficial to combine their farms, or like this family has a good name and a important rabbi in the family, but they're poor, and this family is rich but would love a sage for a grandson, so let's marry them together, whatever. Like that obviously happened, but if the couple met and didn't get along, they were not like forced into it the way, I don't know, at least in like movies other ancient cultures depicted. I don't know, maybe it wasn't that common in any place in the ancient world, but certainly not in Judaism. There is a very strong value about that base of affection being important, which then leads us to the other question of like, what counts as a marriage and who deserves to be married? Oh, Juliet, sorry, I didn't see your hand. Go ahead.
Isn't it an ancient custom that if a woman is raped, the rapist then has to marry her? Did that go away?
Did that go away? Yes. So, the question of a woman's sexual agency didn't necessarily belong to her in that time. It belonged to her father, maybe her older brother, and then to her husband. So although she had the right, she always has the right to say no, and there's a bunch, which tractate was that? I don't think that was Ketubah. Oh, maybe Nedarim. That was also a couple months ago. That was recently, which is vows, right? Like Kol Nidre, all these vows, Nedarim, same root. Where they talk about like, what at what level is a young woman like committed to a man, right? Like at how old does she have to be to get engaged or like be betrothed? If she's betrothed and then backs out, does that count as a divorce? Like they talk about these things in great detail. Which is one of the things that I really love about Judaism, is that there's so much that's like the premise here is very messed up. Like I disagree at the most base level of like, you know, the question of like, you know, because at its core, this is about like removing a woman or a girl's like agency or autonomy. So like that's a problem. But then the way that they talk about every level of like at what point she can back out, and it's like no consequence for either side if she backs out, and then it counts as divorce, how much like of the alimony is not the, obviously like that's again anachronistic, but like how much money is she entitled to, all these things they really like get into. So the same thing is true with rape, that like any act of sex was seen as a betrothal basically, which is why like A Bride for One Night is titled that, because when the rabbis in the Talmud would visit prostitutes, the money exchange was seen as like a dowry and then a divorce like settlement, and like it was all still treated as a one-night marriage. So if first of all, there are different rules depending on where and how a rape occurs because of the like how provable it is that it was rape versus not. So if it happens in a city, and people, and like nobody hears her struggle, or like there's no sign of struggle or whatever, then he has to marry her. If it happens in a countryside and there was no chance for there to be any witnesses, then it defaults more to her word against his, and you know, and then it's treated as a rape and he just owes her money. She's not expected to marry him, which is like, I don't know, he's still not there's not a huge extent of the law that falls down on him, but it's still like the way it is seen is different, based on like how much she can, I don't know, how much she resisted or is believed to have resisted or whatever. It's also, this is like not that related specifically to the question of what counts as a marriage contract, but just as a side note about that, in Sanhedrin, the tractate of the Talmud that deals with a lot of like legal rulings, and where they spend a lot of time talking about these distinctions between like case law, like if she says it happened here and somebody did hear her but couldn't help in time, then it's this. And if it happened here and nobody heard, then it's this. And if it happened here, whatever. They also, in that section of the Talmud, bring it up specifically in the context of, it's one of the 3 rules that you can kill someone to prohibit them from breaking. Like if you know for a fact that someone is about to commit murder, commit rape, or break Shabbat, which like one of these things is not like the other, then you can kill them if that is what it takes to keep them from violating those 3 rules. So again, like it's one of those things in Judaism where like the base concept of like how like what is the value of this woman's like bodily autonomy being debated at all is uncomfortable, but then they get to these like other layers where it does show that like these rabbis were humans, like they did see women as people, just a very different class of people. And, you know, yeah. So the other thing about then that where I was going next, and this is not a terrible segue to have answered your question, is like, so what counts as marriage? So like I said, any sexual act, well, any penetration, I should say, really, counted as a marital act, and thus required some exchange of money, some kind of documentation to be written up that either bound the two partners in question together or officially dissolved their union. You could not just like have casual sex in the, you know, according to Jewish law. But that the concept of like sin with sex outside of marriage doesn't really exist, because, or it only exists in like in situations where a person is hurt, like between two consenting partners. There's not really much concept of like a sinful sex outside of marriage, because by having sex, the two partners are considered married for at least like that period of time, and then they have to like deal with the fallout, which sounds like more trouble than it might be worth. I don't know, unless like you are just going to get married for real and you couldn't wait until after, but like, you know, anyway, but like I said, there are exceptions to that. Sex that is absolutely seen as sinful is incest. I know like they married their cousins all the time, but anything between siblings, even half siblings or step siblings, was not okay. Obviously between parents and children, aunts or uncles and nephews and nieces, again and again, including step parents, like anything like that, very clear in the Torah, in the Talmud. This is unacceptable. It will cause you to be excommunicated from the community. Your children will not be allowed to marry other Jews. Like it's, you know, like that. And then the other category is infidelity. So if neither partner is married, and in some times and places in Jewish law, even just if the man is married, then again, like the sex equals marriage thing plays out. However, if the woman is married and has sex with someone who is not her husband, that's a big no-no. And then after, so obviously in the Torah, we see in the Tanakh, polygamy, fine. Lots of wives for every man. In the Talmud, it doesn't like most of the rabbis in the Talmud, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I don't want to say that it doesn't happen at all in the Talmud. But most of the rabbis have only one wife. Like any that I can think of, if they're married at all, they have only one wife. Unless you count their chavruta partner as their work wife. I'm just saying, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, I would feel like they were having an affair if I were one of their wives. But anyway, as far as like actual halachic marriage, they have only one. But technically in that time period, and especially in Babylonia, like multiple wives were still pretty normal. For European Jews, the ban on polygamy came in, oh, I should have had this date on hand with me, but I want to say like the 17th century. So like not that long ago, really. Again, in like terms of the breadth of Jewish time, that technically polygamy for men was still embraced for most of Jewish culture, and even after Rabbeinu Gershom is the name of the rabbi, the sage in Germany that issued this. It's called a takana, which is a specific category of Jewish law. So where like the Talmud and the codes are things that we might see as like legislation, right? Like they're argued about, they're based on case law, they're worked through, and then they're like decided upon by consensus. A takana is more like the executive order, where like Rabbeinu Gershom just came out and said, like, I think this is wrong. Most people aren't doing it anymore anyway. Like, let's establish this as Jewish law that we're not doing this anymore. And it comes from the root like tikkun olam, tikkun takana, that it's like a repair to Jewish law. So he issues this. It spreads throughout Europe, and for the last 300 years, 400 years, European Jews have only one wife. However, it did not make its way to Middle Eastern Jews or North African Jews. So there were some issues in like the 50s when all of the Middle East kicked out their Jews and they flooded into Europe, and I mean into Israel. And the Israel hierarchy was controlled by European Jews, and they were like, you can't have more than one wife. And then there was like this legal like mishugas. They didn't like make the men divorce their wives, but they were like, that's the law here. So like we can't actually recognize your secondary wives. So like you decide how you're gonna take care of them, but like as far as our census forms are concerned or whatever, like you have one wife. And and it was like a whole thing. And now there's just not enough Jews in the world outside of the US and Israel, like that it's even relevant. I mean, like the Takana held, and then in the places where most Jews live, the law for the country is that you can only have one wife anyway. So to my knowledge, there are no Jewish communities anymore that allow multiple wives, but there are certainly Jewish communities that never fully withdrew the allowance for it, if that makes sense. Like if they were in the right circumstance, I think they could still take a second wife. Yes, David.
Yes, as far as rules, were there rules about ages? Because it seems like I recall some stories, some people seem rather young, especially some of the women that were taken on by powerful kings or whatever.
Yes. Unfortunately, there were not as many rules on ages as there definitely should have been. The main barrier like is puberty. So and again, this is not in the same section as like with the marriage laws, but relevant is that the rabbis spend a lot of time talking about what counts as puberty, right? Because like it's not a threshold that you like cross over once and then it's done, right? Like it's a period of time, it's a spectrum, and it doesn't happen at quite the same age for everybody. And so there are questions about like for both boys and girls, it's like declared that 3 pubic hairs is like the ultimate sign of adulthood and like halachic obligation. A girl can be betrothed if she has like a fold in her chest, like once her breasts have budded enough that it's not completely flat or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. Imagine these like, I mean, they probably weren't old, but like for their time in terms of lifespans, like they're past middle age, sitting around in a study hall, no woman in sight, talking about the budding breasts of 13-year-old girls. It's a little weird, but like these are the things that make up halacha, right? So they had to do it. Yeah, and then unfortunately though, like once a girl or a boy, but usually like the boys had more leeway. Like once they hit puberty, then they had to like study a little bit first and like become a Talmud Chacham, and then they could get married at like 15, 16, but like theoretically a girl could be betrothed at 13. She probably still wouldn't really be married off until 15 or 16, is my sense of the, like, from the anthropology side, not from the halachic side, but that just seems to be like what happened. But then she would be married to that Talmud Chacham who only starts looking for a wife at 15 or 16. So like, you know what I mean? Like there was often, even in the most normal of circumstances, there would still often be like a 2 or 3 year age gap between the men and the women, or the teenagers, the males and females. And then yes, I mean, we see stories in both the Tanakh and the Talmud of, yes, powerful men, grown men, taking 14-year-old girls as wives. And my sense, again, anthropologically, is that that didn't happen often, but the fact that there are any stories and like halakha around it says that it definitely did happen. So yeah, Debbie, you had another question too?
Only when you're finished with this topic. Are you done with this topic?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I just was wondering if there are any other takana besides the one about polygamy, because so many things have changed over the centuries.
There definitely are. I'll have to think about another example.
Okay,
But I'll come back to that. A lot of other halakha evolves more gradually. That was I think it was easy to take that stance unilaterally because like effectively people were already not really doing it. There wasn't an argument in that circumstance. Whereas with some of these other issues, for example, like age of consent, it evolves with our understanding of psychological development. So, or developmental psychology. So it's not like a jump necessarily from one thing directly to the other. I mean, we see in secular culture too, how like it takes time for things to, like, we have new science, but then like, do we fully understand it? Like, do people accept that it's science? Then like the relationship between the so-called hard sciences and the social sciences, and like, you know, it takes time for things to unfold. So a lot of like, you know, comes to mind evolution on halakha around Shabbat, right? Because so much of what counts as breaking Shabbat now are things that did not exist when the rules were made. But a lot of that came about with like big discussion of like what counts as work, what counts as lighting a fire. It wasn't an easy like, well, this is what everybody's doing, so clearly that's it. Usually, sometimes, whatever. But with the takana of Rabbeinu Gershom and polygamy, it was very much like, well, we're already not doing it, and it's weird and it hurts ladies' feelings. So
okay, so there are other routes to official change in the law, not just takana. There are other
yes, yeah,
ways.
there
Yeah,
are
okay.
other routes to official change. So we're going to talk in a future session more about specifically the question of LGBTQ acceptance in Jewish communities. But for example, there are a lot of ways to interpret, you know, the line in Leviticus that bans homosexual sex between two men. And it has traditionally been interpreted a pretty specific way that has led to this halachic unacceptance of gay relationships writ large. But it doesn't have to be that way. And our communities are moving in a direction of learning to to rewrite that halakha a little bit. And, you know, for a lot of the reform, I mean, we read some reform responsa together in a previous year, like we saw, there would be some halachic discussions, some sociological or psychological discussion, but a lot of it comes down to like, this just isn't like what's done anymore and we're not doing it. Or, you know, or like some of the stuff on gender equality in the reform response, I was like, we can't find any halachic reason why this shouldn't be the case. And certainly this is the way the world is going, but we're not sure our Jewish communities are ready for it yet. And so they kind of just like put a pin in it and like, right, like they agreed that women should be ordained 50 years before a woman was ordained, you know? So there's definitely a lot of that happening as well with LGBTQ acceptance, but I have seen some efforts in like the conservative or the modern Orthodox community that are a lot more focused on like true halachic interpretation and rewriting the laws and in an authentic way, to go back to the source material and really like examine what the Hebrew really says, because you know Hebrew is so terse and like packed with, there's like so many multiple meanings in every word and things like that, that there's always room to reinterpret things in the Bible. So back to the topic a little bit about what counts as a marriage. So that's related, right? Because now we're at a point in Jewish history now as like contemporary Americans where there's a question of what counts as a Jewish marriage, like what's halachically acceptable in a ketubah, you know, things like that. And then what can you go to City Hall and have recognized and then still be accepted in your local synagogue as like a Jewish family, right? So those are kind of different questions. And the way some of that evolves it is similar to like what we're talking about. So in in the Tanakh, a Jewish marriage is a marriage between a Jewish man and a woman. She doesn't have to be Jewish. It becomes more important as the Tanakh goes on. You know, in Ezra, he makes all of the Jewish men that were not in exile, like when they come back to the land of Israel, and all these like Samaritan Elohist men are married to Canaanite women, and they want back in with the Jewish community, and Ezra says, no, you have to divorce all your women first. So that's kind of the first time we see this like issue with interfaith marriage, and it's the first layer to the question of matrilineal descent. It did not become universal until later, but that's sort of the first foundation for the argument for matrilineal descent over patrilineal descent. So if you don't know those terms, that's the concept of like a Jewish mother equals a Jewish child, and a non-Jewish mother equals a non-Jewish child unless that child is halachically converted, even if the father is Jewish, whatever. So in the Tanakh, it's patrilineal. Most of the Tanakh, it's patrilineal, and the Judaism, because it's patrilineal, the marriage is valid, you know, as long as the man is Jewish, then she can join the Jewish community too. That starts to shift with Ezra, and then by the time of the Talmud, it is explicit that the marriage must be between two Jewish people of opposite sex. There is a question, again, we can talk about this more potentially in our LGBTQ session, but there is a conversation in the Talmud about variations on sex and who counts as a man or a woman. They call it, it's often translated as like the 6 genders, but they're not really different genders the way we understand like socially gender expressions. It really has to do with like genitals and hormones. Like if somebody has both, you know, a vagina and a penis, or they have maybe one set of genitals, but like their hormonal representation is completely different, right? Like they have to, you know, like a woman with PCOS could potentially like have a full beard, you know, and like what that looks like to an ancient, in the ancient world, you know, like, so how they categorize who can marry who, again, like leaves a lot of room for a modern reinterpretation to open up for variation on like LGBTQ unions. However, it is all still based on the like given idea, like they take as a given that marriage must be between a man and a woman. And so if somebody doesn't fit cleanly in those two categories, then who can they marry, is discussed. And one thing I was reading, it's in one of the earlier chapters of Sacred Encounter that I thought was really interesting was like, that the idea that then these marriages are fully accepted, and there are questions about like, I don't know, some of the way it's discussed is like still a little dehumanizing, or like clearly like this is less than ideal. The ideal is like a fully cisgendered cis-sex. I don't know what the opposite of intersex is, but like, you know, has all the right chromosomes in order of hormones and whatever, like two people of opposite sex being married is the ideal. But the rabbis know that like that's not all, that humanity doesn't actually fit in these binaries that we've tried to create for ourselves. And so then like, what do you do with the in between? And how do you still make room in the community for every single Jew, regardless of like, if they fall outside of the binary that our halakha tries to sort people into. So, you know, again, it's just one of those things in Judaism that I think a lot of this subject matter, or this topic that we're going to dive into these next 5 weeks, it revolves around this concept of like the base assumption that the rabbis were working on is wildly different than my sense of values. But then the things that they discuss within that and how they came to the conclusions that they came to still involves so much like seeing of humanity in a real way that it gives us room to then make the adjustments we need to make. And it does still make me proud to be a Jew, to have that as our foundation. That actually feels like a good place to stop. Let me do my mental checklist and see, did I miss any types of what counts as a marriage? We talked about age gap, we talked about gender, we talked about Jewishness, we talked about procreation. I think that's it. Are there other questions?
The kinds of ceremonies that make a marriage.
Aha. Okay, so again, in the Tanakh, it's pretty they don't give us a lot. It doesn't seem like there is much ceremony other than like the ketubah signing, which the word ketubah itself, I don't think it's not in the Torah anyway. It might be in other parts of the Tanakh. I don't think so though. But it alludes to like marriage contracts being drawn up between the fathers of the bride and groom, you know. And so like certainly there was some of that, an exchange of money, and then like exchange of vows. The ring, as far as I know, became that like a central symbol of marriage in the Talmudic time. It comes to symbolize the exchange of money. Not that there were no more dowries and things like that in Talmudic times. I mean, we know that in a lot of cultures, they continued well into like the medieval period and on. But there was less, my sense is there was less like buying a wife and more like love oriented matchmaking. And so then the ring symbolizes the other stuff that's done like kind of on the backside to exchange goods between the families and help each other out, and whatever kind of was still a dowry but had a different like emotional attachment to it. And so then from seemingly from the Talmudic time, there's another tractate. Like I said, there are several tractates that deal with the questions of marriage. So we've talked about Nedarim is vows, which doesn't have a lot to do with marriage, but they definitely talk in there about like betrothal vows and like if it's not in writing yet, does it count, and like things like that. So there is some of question of marriage related stuff in Nedarim. Tubo is all about writing a ketubah. Gittin is all about writing the get, the divorce, right. Yivamot is about levirate marriage, which like kind of doesn't count, but kind of does. That's the concept of like if your husband dies and leaves you childless, you marry his brother and have a son in his name. And then like pretty quickly that became not practiced. So Yevamo is a lot more about like how you get out of it than about actually that marriage. But it has the word marriage in it, so whatever, I guess it counts. And then Kedushin, that's the one I was about to mention, that like that's another whole tractate, Kedushin, meaning betrothal in a formal sense. So that has to do with like writing the vows and things like that, like not just the marriage contract in the ketubah, but like the promises of the vows and like the dowry stuff potentially and some things like that. But it also from Kedushin we get like the 7 blessings that are still done at Jewish weddings today. A lot of the vow language around like the part of the ceremony where you exchange rings and you say hareat mikudet, like with this ring you are sanctified, no, mikudeshet, whatever, that you are made holy unto me, and you commit to me under the laws of Moses and Israel. That formula that is still said today when you exchange rings at a Jewish wedding. Not that exact formula, I don't think, but that kind of language, that kind of like the setup of a Jewish wedding as we know it is alluded to heavily. Like a lot of it comes from Kiddushin. I'm not sure when like the official ceremony that's in my rabbi manual, like when that was written per se, but it definitely, variations of it seem to go back all the way to, you know, the year 500. So it's pretty old. And that's for like, I don't know what we might call today, like real weddings or whatever. Like that's for the two, you know, in a traditional Jewish sense, at least I would say like that's for 2 adult Jews of opposite gender who like planned to get married. So there were other rituals for the sort of like bride for one night thing, or like, you know, dealing with a potential assault after the fact, or things like that, that I wouldn't necessarily call ceremonies because, you know, they didn't have a lot of fanfare, but like to make it, you know, legally tied up nice in a bow, there were rituals for that. And then at least throughout the 20th century, there were Jewish same-sex commitment ceremonies that were based on the Kiddushin thing, but it was not really, it was not referred to as kiddushin, at least until 2015, when gay marriage became recognized by the state, like federally. And then we could call it a wedding, a marriage. And even then, I'm not 100% sure if the conservative or modern Orthodox, if they have any the conservative movement definitely does do gay weddings. I don't know if they call it kiddushin. I think there are also some like halachic workarounds. So so that's the question on ritual. Yes, Mario.
Excuse me. Rabbi Liz, can you please state when the edict that if the mother is Jewish, the kid is Jewish, period? When did that start?
Okay, so that would be actually a good thing for me to look up to see if there is a takana on that, to see if it ever or when it officially became the halachic stance. It definitely rose in prominence in the diaspora. After the 135 CE, when the Romans fully crushed any Jews left in Israel, and the Jewish community was completely diaspora at that point. That's when it really takes root, and so it does seem to be the assumption in the Talmud, but it's not codified again until the codes, until later. It seems to go through some periods of ebb and flow in its how strongly it was adhered to, at least in terms of I should say how strongly men adhered to the concept of marrying only Jewish women seemed to ebb and flow. I'm not sure that the question of their children's Jewishness, but if they were still considered part of the Jewish community while they were marrying non-Jewish women, I have to assume that their children were also seen as Jewish in some capacity. So yeah, it does, from my understanding, and I could look up more precise when it becomes codified in Jewish law. But from my understanding, it was a little bit of a social creep. Like I said, the foundations start with Ezra when he makes the Elohists in Israel divorce their wives. And then it takes a couple, it takes 1,000 years to really solidify as the only acceptable halachic position. And then it doesn't get overturned officially until the late 1960s for the Reconstructionist movement and the late 1980s for the Reform movement. And interestingly, we are over 2:00, so this is my last thing. Email me if you have other questions that I can address at the beginning of next week. But I was reading something. I was reading the CCAR statement on homosexuality or whatever from the 80s when they first started talking about whether or not they should ordain gay rabbis, or if rabbis were allowed to do same-sex commitment ceremonies. Obviously in the 80s they weren't doing marriages per se anyway, but and they're part of the statement that the CCAR subcommittee on homosexuality put out was that we agree that this is an important ethical value for Reform Judaism to be accepting of gays and lesbians, but we're not I can pull up the exact quote next week, but it's something well, we're worried about how that will make us look in the rest of the Jewish world, and it will it will become more divisive than the question of patrilineal descent. And like, that made me laugh because now here I am in 2023, a rabbi from a pluralistic institute that's worked in a lot of different Jewish communities. And I can tell you the conservative movement is pretty much all there on LGBTQ rights. There are some ways that like socially conservative synagogues sometimes tend to be more conservative, like lowercase conservative than Reform synagogues, but by and large, you know, they're liberal Jews. The conservative movement as like a hierarchical body has, you know, completely ordained the idea of same-sex marriage. They ordain LGBTQ rabbis, like they're all in with us there. They still will not accept patrilineal descent. And a conservative rabbi who officiates an interfaith marriage will be kicked out of the rabbinic assembly. We don't have a concept of like defrocking in Judaism, so they will still be rabbis, but they can't work for affiliated conservative synagogues anymore. So clearly the CCR subcommittee on homosexuality in 1985 misread that one. And that's we're all in there. We will talk more next week because we gotta go.